right, what I'd like to do today is go through Chapter 5 in your book, and hopefully we can get this done in a class period. If we can, then Thursday will be a lab. If you want to follow along code-wise, then what I'd suggest you do is just what I did, and that is get into Eclipse. Let me close this door. We don't need that stuff anymore. All right, get into Eclipse like we have been doing, and import the project over from the P drive. Like I said, that's what I did. I've got it up here. This is the one that they create. It's called a flag quiz. The chapter itself starts on about page 137. All right. So again, that's what we will be going through. If we get through all of it today, great. Then we don't have to worry about, then Thursday will be a lab in here. So, and if that works, if we get through the chapter today, Thursday will be lab in all three classes. I already said that it was going to be a lab in 164, and in the iOS class, we said Thursdays are going to be labs, at least until break. All right. So this chapter, you can see the objectives. I don't want to read them to you, but one of the key or hallmarks of the chapter is they talk about fragments. And the idea is, when you look at the way that this program looks, when you bring it up in the emulator, you see right there it's in portrait mode, and if you click right here, it brings up a menu, and the menu says Settings. All right, if you click on Settings, what basically does is it replaces what was there with this, and you notice that there's two different things that are set up in here. These right here to display 3, 6, or 9 buttons, that's a mutually exclusive choice, so you can only choose one of those. All right, so if I wanted there to be 9 or 6 settings, I just click one of those. I don't want to do that. All right, the other one is the regions of the world, and what this particular app does is, if you look in here, he literally has inside of his assets folder, he's got subfolders with flags of different African nations, Asian nations, European nations, North American, Oceania, and South American nations. So here you can have as many or as few as you want checked as possible. If you uncheck them all, it wouldn't make any sense to take a quiz on nothing. So what he does is, if you uncheck them all and you click OK and you go to run the quiz, it automatically just checks North America. All right. I mean, that could be reset if you wanted it to, but that's the way that he's got it set up right now. And I believe by default, when you start, everything is checked. All right. Okay, and again, he uses fragments with that. Some of the stuff that he does in here in this chapter, he'll talk about better ways of doing it, but that better way, unfortunately, won't be until we get to Chapter 8, which is on the address book app. Okay? All right, I already talked to you about the options menu. Other stuff that's mentioned in here, as you notice, use a preference fragment. All right? To manage and persist the user preferences. Already showed you some of that. The assets, again, if I do bring that up and you look in here, you'll notice that in assets, he's literally, by default, in there you have everything, well, either you have like your HDPI and all that other stuff in here, but what he does is he says you can set it up so you can set up a folder structure, which is what he's done. Now, a couple things, too, that just so you see this as we go on in here, all right, that, for example, if I go to res, you might not notice anything, but there's a few things to notice, such as there's the layout. There's a layout if you want to bring it up in landscape. All right? And why am I telling you that? Because if you notice, there's an activity main XML, and there's an activity main XML. And it has to be the exact same name because the system has to know, based on the orientation, all right, which of those it should call. And the file has to be exactly the same name. If it was called something else, it wouldn't be a good thing. All right? I think you get a runtime error if that happens. Plus, when we look in here and we look at some of the stuff that's under the, well, we'll talk about this folder called anim, which is short for animation. And the way that this is set up is that you take this quiz and it'll ask you, for instance, it'll show a flag of the United States. And if you guess the United States, on the bottom, there'll be a label that comes in that says correct in green. Okay? If one of the choices is South America, let's just, I don't know, Canada, and you choose Canada, which would be wrong, it does an animation to make it look like you're the machine shaking, to tell you no, basically, and that comes up in red. Okay, and that's done in there. Okay. Under the values, there's some stuff in here we have not talked about before. There's an arrays.xml that he'll go over. Colors. So far, what he's done in the chapter is he's used the standard built-in colors. Here he doesn't want to do that. He wants green for you got a correct guess and red for an incorrect guess. He'll talk a little bit more. We've done a little bit with the dimensions for setting up spacing. All right, natural same size spacing. He'll get into that. If you look in here at his strings, this is really exploded from the stuff that we've talked about and we've looked at. Those are all different strings that he set up. So he's got quite a few of them set up in here. All right. And the styles, we'll get to all the rest of the stuff later. Okay? So define an animation and apply it to a view. Use what's called a handler to schedule a future task to perform on a GUI thread. And what he means by that is it's set up so after you, literally, if you've got a picture of a flag and you've got 3 buttons, how many guesses do you want? You want to take a wild guess as to how many guesses you get? That would be 3. All right? And the way that it's set up is as soon as you get the right one, literally it kind of puts a freeze on it so you can't guess again. And it's scheduled so that in about 2 seconds, 2,000 milliseconds, that the next flag will show. All right? So that your next iteration, or if you're at the end, that it'll tell you how many you got right. And it figures that out and it shows you that also. All right? TOS I've shown you a little bit. His TOS are really simple and they're at the bottom. You'll see them in the book and we'll get to them at that time. All right? We've looked a little bit at intents before. Okay? And basically it says there launch a specific activity with an explicit intent. So far when we've used intents, they've been implicit intents. In other words, when something happens, the system realizes that it should do something in response. All right? But sometimes if something happens, there might be multiple things that you can do to respond to it. So what he's saying there, if that's the case, then you will have to call the intent yourself. So I've talked about this in earlier classes before. Implicit means it's done naturally via the software. Explicit means it's done via the programmer. All right. He'll talk about some of the collections in the Java util package, defining the layouts for the multiple device orientations, again, landscape and portrait, and using the log mechanism. All right. This is the first time he's really getting into the log. We've looked a little bit at log before. I know John uses it. I wish I used it more than I do. But he also mentions that when you do that, you can siphon what gets shown in there. For instance, if you only wanted errors shown, you'll notice that all that green stuff that typically means everything's going well wouldn't show. All right, he gets into that in here also. So again, the program, I'm not going to read any of this stuff to you. This is the flag quiz. I already showed you what it looked like. So there it is with 9 buttons. And you'll notice the key thing to realize here is when you've got it portrait like this, you've got the options, so that setting thing shows in here, but you only have one fragment, basically one part of the screen that's showing right now. All right. On the other hand, if you put it into landscape, you've got 2 parts. Does that make sense to everybody? And there's certain things in here that you've got to be leery of. All right. Not a big thing in here. You've got room here for the flag. That's going to be an image view. And you got room down here for a label. That's not a big thing. But when you turn it on its side, you've got to make sure that whatever you want to put in here, you've got enough room for it. Okay? And unlike the apps that we've looked at thus far in here, there's no keyboard in this one. There's no need to have a keyboard in this one. All right? It's all basically button generated. So this thing that you see right here on the left-hand side, number of choices, etc., that thing that's right there is hidden in here. That is only shown if you click the options menu, and once you pick one, then this disappears, and that shows. And again, you can choose either one of these. We talked about that already too. And a lot of times that's what happens when you run apps, be it an iPhone, iPad app, or be it an Android app, that if you run it in landscape, It's, for lack of better words, it's kind of like the old days of HTML where you had frames along the left-hand side, or like a table of contents type of thing, and then on the right you had everything else. It's quite often done like that. All right. So they have you test drive it, and that's what I've shown you. Again, he talks in here on page 139, it looks like, and he mentions this, what I already showed you. All right, that's the button that's up there. And let's see. All right, that's this right here. Oops, that's what happens when you go too far, I guess, huh? Thank you. All right, so he's talking about the button that's up there. All right. He shows you a bunch of pictures on the next page. It's kind of what I've already shown you, okay? And talks a little bit about how to play the game. I think we all can understand this. Again, you'll notice that it doesn't show there because the book's not in color, but that would be green. That actually is the flag for Aruba. So if you choose it, Aruba, the name of it will appear there in green. All right. On the other hand, if you get it wrong, I don't know if I guess they didn't show the wrong one. Incorrect. And it gives you that little, what it is it's animating, going like this, almost like shaking your head no type of an idea. And it goes like left, right, left, right, left, right, fairly quickly. And he explains all that too. All right, as far as how that's done. At the end, it shows you how many guesses total you made and what your percentage was. All right, so notice he made 16 guesses. There's 10 flags, so it's, you got 6 wrong, in other words. All right, so you got 10 out of 16. And he tells you the percentage. And he shows that up as an alert at the end. Okay? Hopefully, I went over that quickly, but hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. And we've done things similar to this in some of the other chapters. All right? Again, not my intention to read to you in here. So he talks about menus. I believe we all understand how menus work, etc. He uses all of the default menu type of structure. He doesn't do really any rewrite. And that's why when you click that, it just said settings, because that's the way it's set up by default. All right. I believe it's in Chapter 8 when we do the address book one. That will be a little bit more breadth and depth of coverage. Just so you know, too, the plan is I'm going to go over this chapter today. If we get done with it today, great. If we need some time on Thursday, then that's so be it. Next week is going to be lab again. Okay. Then the week after that, that's the week before break. We'll go over Chapter 6, okay? Then when you come back, it'll be lab again, then probably 7 lab, 8 lab. Chapter 9, I'm just going to go over it. I'm going to tape it and put it out there. That's just how to put your stuff out onto the App Store, and so I'm not going to go over that in class. But the hope is that probably within the first 4 or 5 weeks after we get back from break, we'll be done with the book, all right? And the rest of the chapter, or the rest of the class, then will be, will you get a next assignment? The next assignment you'll get will be after Chapter 6, but that one is just going to say whatever program you've decided to be your working program, add this stuff to it. And it'll be stuff like add fragments, etc. All right? Okay. So he explains in here, as he says, a fragment is a reusable portion of a user interface. All right? That's usually what it is, but it can represent other things. We'll go over that more in Chapter 8. But as he says, he's got some really good URLs in here in the chapter. If you haven't read through it, you might want to take some time and read through the book, because virtually all of them are from the developer.android site, and their page on fragments is really good. All right, they go through the fragment life cycle, and they tell why you have to call things at a certain time, etc. It's very well done. All right, and he says the flag quiz defines the following direct and indirect fragment classes. So we're going to have a quiz fragment class, a settings fragment class, all right, and as it says, an anonymous inner class that extends dialog fragment. That won't be new because we've used that dialog fragment in here before, all right, but the other stuff will be. All right, here's one of them. Okay, it says for more information, yeah, no, not that one. This was someplace in here. There you go. the fragment lifecycle methods. Does this stuff look familiar to you? Okay, we've been overwriting on create forever. Okay, and this time we are going to overwrite on create view. We haven't done that before, but we're going to do that here. And again, we'll talk about it when we get to that point. But like I said, I looked at this one, and I thought in particular this URL that's right here was pretty good. Because among other things, of course not, they like I said, they go through the fragment lifecycle. Okay. All right, it gets to be a little, if you haven't read the book, a little hinky here, because it's just something different. Again, a parent activity manages this fragment via a fragment manager that's returned by the activity's get fragment manager. Hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense when we look at the code, which is what we're going to do in just a bit. As it says, as you'll see in Chapter 8, you can use fragment transactions. And that's actually a term you should all know, because we talked about transactions in the terms of database. And the idea is the same. A transaction is one or more actions that are bundled together and that either all succeed or all fail. And in much the same way, they're talking about here that you can use fragment transactions to dynamically add, remove, and transition between different fragments. All right. We also get into preferences here. All right. And what are those preferences? I already showed them to you. All right. One was that mutually exclusive set of preferences. You can have 3 buttons show, 6 buttons show, or 9 buttons show. All right. That was the one. The other one was non-mutually exclusive. In fact, they call it multi-select preference, where you could select one or more countries of the world to show their flags. All right. He also goes through a few other things in here. He talks about a built-in routine called shuffle. All right. And I don't know if you remember when they came out, you know, when iPods, not when they first came out, but pretty close to when they first came out, there was that real little one that came out, that shuffle. You know, so if you had 1,000 songs, you could sit there and you could literally almost shake it and it would play them and always in different order. It's kind of what he's doing here. He wants to make sure that you are randomly getting different flags so that you don't get real good and, oh, I memorized this one. So he doesn't want the same 10 to show all the time, is what I'm saying. All right. That assets folder, as I already mentioned, it says the images are loaded into the app only when needed and are located in the app's assets folder. Now, just so you know, I put this stuff out here. Again, I said this to you before, but I just want to show you this. On the P drive for the class, I just pulled this one out and put it in today's in-class folder. All right, so that's all the flag quiz stuff. And you look under assets, and there's the African flags, the Asian flags, etc. I'm not going to click the rest. You get the idea. But he also, just so you know what he also has in here, I just took that out of the source code that's here, but he has an images folder. And that's the thing that he goes and basically just drags over. Okay? All right. So he explains this, and he talks about the idea, the reason that you would want to have in this assets folder, you'd want to have folders, is because it just brings some semblance of order. You can put all your African flags together, your North American flags together, your South American flags together, etc. And he says they're accessed via the asset manager, which he also goes through in here. All right. One of the better parts of this chapter is this table that's shown here on the middle of page 145 in the book. I already mentioned the anim folder, which he uses for the shake effect. All right. And then there's an animator folder, and as it says, it's for property animations. We're not going to get into that right now. Okay. There's a color folder because, again, so far, everything that we've done, if you remember, we'd always chosen something like Android :/ hollow or something like that. We don't do that here. All right. So we want to create our own colors. There's a raw folder. Typically for that raw folder, that's for binary data. So if you were going to go and you were going to be reading in music or video, you know, any kind of audio or video, typically it would go in there. Menu, as it says, folder names that begin with menu describe menu contents. And again, we're just using the built-in one here. And then XML. We've looked at those before. All right, it says folder names that begin with XML don't fit into any other categories. We've already looked at some of the stuff in the XML folder before. All right. What he mentions here up on the top of page, what is that, 146, it says, for this app's main activity, you'll use size and portrait qualifiers to determine which layout to use. So basically what will happen is the system will go in, and based on code that you put in that uses built-in Android constants, it'll figure out whether your orientation is portrait or landscape. And that's what he's talking about in here. Okay. Toast we've already talked about. I don't really want to hit on those again. Again, just a little brief message that comes up. You can put it where you want to put it. You can say whatever you want it to say. Normally, you know, that they should be used but not overused. All right. Using a handler again, when you make a correct guess, the app displays the answer for 2 seconds, then it displays the next flag. And one thing you have to realize is this. This isn't a term, these aren't terms that we really talked about a lot in here, but I want you to at least hear them. When you are running your program like this, you're running it in a single thread. So basically, whatever's running has got control of the system. All right? And sometimes when you run certain applications, they're multi-threaded, where you can do a bunch of different things at the same time. This isn't one of them. All right? And it says operations rather than interact with or modify the GUI must be performed in the GUI thread because GUI components are not thread safe. In English, what that means is the system doesn't know. It has everything that you're doing that's going to interact with the GUI in a single thread, because it doesn't know if it gave it off to another thread, it wouldn't know if, oh, maybe you got a phone call or whatever, you wanted it to basically suspend what you were working on. So it does everything inside of that thread, which basically has got control, all right, of the program, unless you answer the phone or you turn it off or you do something else. Again, when the user makes an incorrect choice, the app shakes the flag by applying an animation to it. We'll see that in just a bit. The exception messages, as it says, when things occur that shouldn't, okay, Android provides the log cat or the log class, and again, another good URL that's shown here on page 147. Using an explicit intent, we've talked about this before. Again, in Chapter 4, we showed an implicit intent. All right, Section 5.5 will show an explicit intent. Again, one that we're responsible for. Okay. He does use some stuff in here. You may or may not remember this. All right, we looked at it, but we didn't spend much time on it. But when we talked about the chapter in arrays in the Gaddis book, we talked a little bit about array lists. You may or may not remember it. You saw the angle bracket type of thing in there. And that's what he's talking about here. It says the app uses various data structures from the java.util package. It loads image files for the regions and stores them in an array list string. And why that? We know this. Because if you decided later that you wanted to add another country, all right, I don't know if Antarctica actually has flags, but I didn't see that in there. So if you wanted to do that, you could add that and its flags. You're using an array list here, so you can dynamically allocate or deallocate as you have need to. As it says, they use a second array list to hold the image names for the countries and a set string to store the world regions in a quiz. You'll see this stuff as we go on. Yes. You could do it that way. It would actually be simpler than the way we've done it. Or I mean, let's talk about doing it as simple as possible. You'd call your quiz Flags of the World, and you just throw everything in there. You know what I mean? It would be a hodgepodge type of an idea. With one or more array lists. Yeah, I mean, that would be a way of doing it. There are other ways it could be done than the way they're doing it here. The way that he's doing it is probably the most straightforward way. All right. Over the weekend, I rewatched the tape on this. The last one that we looked at was about 2 hours. This one was 3.5. All right. And I didn't think I would want to put you through that. I didn't even know if we could watch it over 2 class periods, to be honest with you. But one thing, maybe you've noticed from Dytel, and maybe you haven't, I don't know. Again, in 2 weeks, when I ask you to do course evaluations, I'd like to hear what you think about the book. Because if you think it really stinks, I won't use it again. All right? But one thing about Dytel is the books they write, they're very, very straightforward. They have a way of doing things, and they don't care about what the language is. They're going to do it. If there's a way to do it exactly this way in every language, that's the way they'll choose. And normally, or typically, in my opinion, they pick what's probably the most straightforward way of doing it. All right. So they have you create the project. There's nothing new in there. Here's all the strings that they're putting in. So again, that's your resource. That's what goes into the R file. These are their values. So what's new in here? 2 things. The results line, right there, and the question line, right there. Okay? Look a little bit familiar to you? Kind of almost looks like what you'd have in a C language and like in a printf type of an idea, where that percent $2 sign 0.02f, everybody see that right here? All right. That literally is floating point with 2 decimal places. Okay? That's decimal or int, but these numbers here, that 1 that's there and that 2 that's there, those are placeholders. Those are argument values. So that would say whatever that first argument is, which is your number of guesses, and whatever your second argument is, which is your percentage that's correct. And in the same way, notice that this is %1 and %2, so that's argument 1 and argument 2, but they're both decimal. This is always going to be, for question, that'll always be a 10, the way it's set up right now, because you have 10 flags with each round of the quiz. All right, so that number, that literally will always be 10 right there. And this will always tell you what question out of the 10 you're on. All right, hopefully that made at least some sense. He does talk a little bit more on the bottom of 148 and going on to 149. So if you don't like my verbiage, you can look at his. All right. Then he starts to get into, again, some of the new stuff that he's doing in here. This arrays.xml file. All right. And I don't know if this will help or hurt, but let's literally bring that file up. Okay. And when you look at what's in here, we'll look at it in its XML format. Maybe that'll make a little bit more sense. So here's his regions: Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, Oceania, and South America. Do you notice how each one of those that has 2 words, there's an underscore between them? Because that's something you're going to be referencing in code. These are just titles. So there's no reason to put blanks. You can use blank spaces between them. There's not a problem. Right? So he's setting up 3 different arrays in this thing here called arrays.xml. And as he explains in here, again, probably better than I just did, he says in section 4, on the last chapter, we created a string array. All right, it says technically all of your app's resources in the res value folders can be defined in the same file, but you typically don't do that. All right. So as he says in here, the app has 3 string array resources, and I just told you what they were. So he tells you how to create them next on the bottom of 149 and 150. It isn't hard. All right, we've created strings before. It's basically you're doing it the same way. And again, it is totally legit. If you want to create them using XML, you can do it like that too. Some people don't like using this and clicking add and putting something new in there. All right. When we've gone in the past and we've done this, all right, you can go, I find this easier to work with like this than going into here, clicking add and choosing this stuff, etc. But either way works. You get the same result either way. there are it 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 to me it's not inconceivable to think that there are people out there. I don't know any. I don't know a lot of iOS and Android developers, but it wouldn't be inconceivable for me to think that there are people out there right now that know absolutely nothing about Java, that their job is to develop interfaces for these. And if they knew XML, they wouldn't have to know a lick about Java. But yeah, I mean, and what you just said, yeah, if you want to see how much you're getting out of this class, or how far hopefully you think you've gone, go in and try to build something from scratch and do it using just XML. You can get a lot done. I don't mean copy what you had. I mean start from scratch and see what you can put in there. All right? Because most, if not all of the time, you should be able to. You can't put the logic in, all right, but you should be able to build your strings. You should be able to build your interface. You should be able to set up your colors. You know, all the stuff that we're doing on here, your dimensions, etc. So he has you come in and do the colors. That one was pretty simple. All right, maybe you want to see it, maybe you could care less, but that's just correct answer and incorrect answer, and there they are. He uses hex colors in here. There's other ways you can do it. I believe it's possible to go in and there's an RGB that you can use. I haven't, but I believe there's one. You can also, there is some work that you can do with opacity on this stuff, just so you know. All right, probably the simplest way to do it is this way. And he could have gone in and used some of the built-in colors. There are X number of built-in colors, and there probably is a built-in for red, and there probably is a built-in for green. But if you notice, he's not using true green here. True green would be 00FF00. All right, he wanted to use a darker form of green, so he's got 00CC00. Red, he just used red. So again, he walks you through the steps here. He goes in the dimensions file. Now, hopefully by now, I'm not speaking out of turn. When you look at this, that's in orange. Hopefully by now, at least one of the things you know is the difference between DP and SP. SP are scale-independent pixels, and that's for text. DP is for density-independent pixels, and that's for anything non-text. So what he's saying in here is that spacing, that's more, for lack of better words, that's like padding. All right? And the answer size, that's the font size that you want. And you'll notice he's used 40 in there, which is not exactly 40 points, but if you want to sort of look at it that way, because he wanted it to stand out. But again, as mentioned earlier, that if you're going to do that, then you have to make sure that you give yourself enough room on the bottom. So when I put that here, all right, did you notice too, if you look up on the screen here, I'm going to try Japan. I'm hoping it's wrong. Watch how this shakes. See that? It's the image is supposed to be shaking, basically. All right. And, gee, you think I'll get it? You know, I can't choose these two anymore because, no, you get 3. And it's funny because when you watch him on the tape, either he doesn't remember or he really is an idiot. Because he'll be taking them, and with some of them, and after a while you can tell he's getting frustrated on the tape. He just starts guessing the first one, you know, and he goes through it, and he got like, it was like less than 50%. He's like, I guess I don't play this game enough or something. That was about as humorous as I've ever heard him on a tape. All right. Activity settings, XML. This is the top of page 151. As he says here, you'll create the layout for the settings activity. All right. When you add a fragment to a layout, the ID can create the fragments class for you. So what he's trying to do is kind of set you up with a template to set all this stuff up. All right. And the cool thing about these fragments, using a fragment in here is somewhat like when you use a UI view in iOS. Remember when we dragged them out and took up the whole screen? That's kind of what a fragment does. All right, a lot of times you won't put anything else there. However, when he does this, and hopefully this will make sense to you when you see it, all right. Well, I thought when we did the Control F11 it would. Yeah. I don't think so. I'll have to check. But the point is, we'd see the 1/2 over here. We see the 1/2 over here, so your settings would be here. That's a fragment, and that's a fragment. All right, you'll see that as we go on. Well, that was interesting anyway. As we... Okay. I was not aware of that. I guess I should have run the... Well, I tested it, but I didn't test it in landscape before. So, again, as mentioned previously, there'll be an activity _main.xml layout, one for phones and one for tablet orientation. And as mentioned before, if you go and look over here, there's my activity main and there's my activity main. All right, and they do not look the same. All right. Fragment quiz layout on the bottom of page 151 and going on to 152. The key thing is this. All right, this is what he's saying. Here are his names. One thing that he comes up with, again, this is him. You may or may not agree with this, okay? In fact, he tells you that he did some sloppy programming on here. He doesn't give these names. They're literally button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, button 5, button 6, button 7, button 8, and button 9. Because he says technically they're going to be different every time, right? And he also says that when he starts, he takes all 9 buttons and makes them invisible. And then he goes and he checks to see whether you've got it set to 3 or to 6 or to 9 on the setting. So if it's set to 3, he only brings back the first row, etc. All right, but he shows you the names that he uses here, is what I wanted to get across to you. All right. So next he says how to create that fragment quiz. So he shows you how to create the GUI. And this is what I mentioned before. There's the button names. And he puts each in their own linear layout, which makes sense because they're 3 distinct entities. All right. And he goes through on the tape, this took a long time. I was just surprised. He goes through with each component what he sets stuff to. Are people, you know, I'm asking you this. I'm asking this. Are you at least wrapping yourself around the difference between wrap content and match parent? Does that make sense to people? That if you use wrap content, the idea is it only uses as much space as it needs. But if you use match parent, it uses as much space as is available. Does that make sense? All right. How about weight? We've talked about this, that the weight by default is set to 0. When you set it to 1, and you've got different things competing for the same real estate, 1 means whatever's 0, give it as little real estate as possible. Whatever 1 has, give it as much real estate as possible. All these things tend to work in conjunction with one another. All right. I know with Mark, we were looking at one of his, I don't know if it was the miles per gallon one last week or not. And a lot of times when you set this stuff, if you set something to, for example, if you set it to match parent, it might go shooting off the screen. All right. You can't let that stuff bother you when you're doing it. In fact, I watched 3 or 4 over the weekend. I watched 3 or 4 iOS videos, and all these guys were laughing, and they're like, "Please don't let it bother you when you're creating, and you're starting to do all these different kinds of layouts, and you're doing auto layout." He said, "When I'm looking at it, sometimes my screen just looks like it's almost all orange," and he's like, "You can't let that bother you. It's going to eventually be fixed." So starting on the bottom of 154 here, he goes into, as it says in the last section was the portrait orientation. Now we do the landscape. Remember, the difference is the landscape has got 2 fragments in it. It's got the one that's got the settings thing, and it's got the other one that's got the flags in the information. So that's what he explains in here. He mentions then, as said, you got to right-click in that res folder, and that's what he did up here. He right-clicked, and he chose new folder. All right, it was nothing special about doing that, and when he did, he called it layout large land. There are names that you are supposed to use with this. I mean, like LLL wouldn't mean much to the system. All right. But again, as mentioned, not only is the name of the folder important, but the file names here and here must be identical. Again, I'm not going to go through these preferences. You guys can read that stuff if you're so inclined to do so. Kind of interesting here on the bottom of 156 and going up to 157 when he talks about creating the flag shake animation. And he goes through this in some depth. On the tape, he goes through it in a lot of depth. But he goes through it, and he is actually using some mathematical stuff where he's working with deltas. Because what he wants to do is he wants to give it that effect. And remember, one thing about using an emulator, normally at least, emulators do not show animation very well. All right, emulators or simulators. So he's doing what he can here. And he goes through, exactly what's happening with that shake effect and whatever. All right, that gets us to the code then. On page 158. Let's just start on this. We'll go into it a little bit, then we'll take a break, and then we'll finish it up, hopefully today. As it says, class main activity hosts the app quiz, the quiz fragment when you're running in portrait orientation. He goes into a lot of depth and breadth of coverage here to mention to you the new stuff. All right. So all your new imports that we have not used before, that's all stuff that you see. It kind of looks gray when you look at it. He sets up a couple of keys, and what he's saying here is, rather than having to remember the name pref underscore number of choices, he just calls it choices. Rather than having to remember pref underscore regions to include, he just calls it regions. So he sets up constants for these predefined variables just because it'll be easier when he's writing code. All right. Notice private Boolean phone device equal true, used to force portrait mode. And preferences change. Did the preferences change? And why is that important? If you're playing the game the way that he's got this set up, what's supposed to happen is if you're in the middle of playing the game and you change your orientation, basically it's supposed to stop that game, set your orientation, then restart the game so you're at a new one with flag number 1. Does that make sense? And that's what he's talking about in here. No, it doesn't continue. It's not that you couldn't do that. I think he was just trying to show some stuff in here. I believe that's why he did it that way. Again, we've already talked about this. The res layout from activity main if you're running in portrait, and the res layout large land if you're running on a tablet in landscape orientation. All right. So when you look in here, I'm not going to go through this. It's fairly complex. But if you look here on figure 519, which is on the bottom of page 159, and it goes up to the top of page 60. All right. What he's doing in here is he's using a lot of predefined constants to figure out what the screen size is. All right. Now, if that was me, how would I do that? I'd just be Googling the hell out of it until I found something that looked similar to what I was looking for. All right. And if you look in here, hopefully with what he's got, that makes some sense. If it's screen layout large, or if it's screen layout extra large, all right, it's not a phone. Right. If it is a phone, as it's saying, the only thing we're going to allow for a regular phone is portrait orientation. All right. I think this isn't a bad spot to stop. Let's just take a break now. It's 1:45. Let's come back at 2 o'clock. All right. No, he's trying to show that, yeah. No, there's a lot of ways that this could be done, and I'm not saying the way he did it is the best way or not the best way, but it's the way that he chose.